Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today, I don't want to talk about a specific book that I've read, but rather I want to do the usual wrap-up and TBR that comes at the end of each month. In terms of what I read in February, I think I read more than usual, and I also read a diverse number of reads as I focused on Black short stories and Black poems, or from poems from Black authors during the month of February, and I feel like I got a good experience of different cultures and different viewpoints, which is always a necessity. Of course, in that exploration, I also came across a number of other reads that I want to check out. So I'll be sure to do that during the rest of the year as well, as it's important to get those different perspectives outside of February as well. And in March, I feel like I have a big hefty read or hefty sort of TBR, although it's more to do with one specific book, a fantasy book from an author that I'm sure BookTube must adore in some way, because they talk about this author quite frequently, and so I think that's going to take up a chunk of my time in March. So I might not get to every single book that I have or that I have planned in March, but I do have a couple of good books planned that if I don't get to it in March, I'll probably get to it in April. So without further ado, let's talk about the February wrap-up and the March TBR. I'll start with the wrap-up and then the TBR, and we'll move on from there. So in February, I read quite a few books. I read Batman, The Return of Bruce Wayne, which was a story about Batman after the Justice League fought with Darkseid. Batman was scattered throughout time as a time bomb, as a way of Darkseid finally getting his chance to destroy the universe. And so Batman existed in multiple different time periods. It was very interesting, but it was just okay. Not a lot worth talking about, apart from the interesting art here and there. But ultimately, it's kind of in the bottom tier of Batman comics. So not really recommended at all. I also read Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, which I thought was really powerful and probably the best of the month in terms of books that I read. Fun Home was about Alison's own experience of her journey towards coming out and realizing that she was queer, and relating it back to her father's experience, where she sort of questioned what his life was like as an apparent repressed homosexual, growing up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, in the time that, or not, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, in the time before Allison, and before there was really widespread acceptance of homosexuality. Not that there still aren't problems with coming out in this day and age, but it was probably a little bit easier for Allison, comparatively speaking. And I really like what she had to say, especially the themes about wondering if she was sort of projecting on her father, if he had a certain experience and she was just sort of making things up in order to match her narrative, and wondering, if there was even a way of knowing her father, if what his experience and what his like just general feelings were like, and ultimately coming to the conclusion that she might not know and she might never know, and that could be very hard. And I remember having a very powerful sort of feeling or reaction to that, just in terms of, my own father, not really understanding where he came from and feeling that like I'll never truly get to know him. So I thought it was a really good story, and one that I think everyone should seek out. If you're going to read a limited number of graphic novels in your lifetime, make sure that Fun Home is one of them. I also read Members Only by Samir Pandaya. I thought it was really good. Again, in any other month, this might be the best of the month, but unfortunately it had to compete with Fun Home. Members Only was a fascinating study of of internalized racism, as well as like the racism a person experiences. I especially like how Samir Pandaya pointed out that racism and segregation still exist in country club settings, and also noting how the way that conservative reactionaries and those in power like channel those with less money or resources to direct their hate at minorities, like the way they do that is very similar to how violent racial clashes have happened in the past. So just noting the seeds for genocide and whatnot can exist within your very own country, and how no one's really addressing things like that. It's a really interesting story, one that I didn't think I was going to enjoy because the setup was a little bit weak, but Pandaya was able to carry it home in a very effective way. I also read White Rage by Carol Anderson. It was an informative book about sort of white reactions by white people to civil rights progress through time. Just noting how they there's been violence done towards people of color whenever they've asked for even just a little bit of aid or not being lynched to death or stuff like that. This was recommended to me by Bevan, who does not have a channel but should get one very soon. I thought it was pretty good. Certainly won't make any year-end list, but it's very interesting read that I think people should at least seek out if they're wondering why there's so much like negative reactions towards the civil rights movement. Again, relating back to the fact that those in power are channeling that sort of negative reaction to minorities to keep them in their place. I also read Swamp Thing Volume 6 by Alan Moore, which I thought was great. A really strong ending to an otherwise amazing series. I certainly enjoyed like Alan Moore's discussion about Swamp Thing's great power and his responsibility to humanity, and how ultimately it's best for him to probably stay out of things, otherwise humanity probably won't progress that far. I also like his horror take on the series. I know Swamp Thing was already heavily horror centric, but he took it in different directions, and even though Swamp Thing is definitely supposed to be the hero of the saga, there are bits where he comes off as a horrifying sort of devastating monster that's capable of destroying humanity, and not much can stop him, and not much should be able to stop him, because he is ultimately a force for good in fighting for the earth whenever necessary. So I'm really happy that I read that, but of course that also means that I'm on the lookout for new series, a new sort of comic arc that's worth following, like The Sandman or Scott Pilgrim, although I stopped that, or Swamp Thing. So if you have any recommendations, let me know in the comments below, because I would always be interested in following along with a great storyline. I also read Garbage Wars, which was about the history of the sanitation industry in Chicago, along with themes of environmental justice and environmental racism. I thought it was just okay. This was for my book club that I'm a part of with Bevan. If you're interested in joining that book club, remember that there's a link to the Discord in the description, and so you can join and find out when book club things are. But I thought it was okay. It wasn't that interesting in terms of telling me any new information. It felt a little too academic for my taste, not really firmly rooted in actually addressing the problem, more so in pointing it out. But I do like how the author pointed out that they're like the same people who cause like environmental hazards at one point might come around again to do it again after we boot them out to do it again. So it always pays to remain vigilant and to remember that that you need allies in the environmental justice movement, because if you try to tell the sanitation people, like, oh, you can't put a dump in our backyard, they might put it in someone else's backyard. And so you kind of have to work really hard to make sure that they're not putting it in an area that is full of historically marginalized people. They shouldn't put it in any area where there's people, but they'll try to do that if nobody speaks out about it. I also read Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret by Judy Blume. It's solid young adult fiction. As I said in the video, I really like that Judy Blume seems to respect her young readers and is willing to say, hey, you're going through this experience. It's perfectly normal, to go through this experience, and it's not like you're the only person dealing with this, which is what I think a lot of teenagers need to hear, because we often it's a very difficult time being a teenager, and to go through these great bodily and physical and social changes has to be very difficult. So I'm glad Judy Blume is able to handle such a story about puberty and religion with such care. And then I also read Dear Committee Members by Julie Schumacher. I thought it was pretty good. I didn't really have too much to say about it because there wasn't a lot of story to it, and so there wasn't really much to talk about. I feel like if I made a video about it, it would be kind of bare bones. But what's interesting about it is it was a story told through a series of letters of recommendation and letters to colleagues and friends, which is something that I hadn't really seen before. It does have an interesting sort of discussion about what we see in others and whether or not that's fair. But ultimately the story suffers in that it comes from a limited viewpoint, and that you're really only seeing things from the main character's perspective. And although there are other characters, they're a bit one-dimensional because we only hear about them through the letters and whatnot. And so although it's good, it's something that I feel is a bit gimmicky ultimately, and kind of wears out its welcome about 50 pages, and maybe even less than that, because there are moments where it's beautiful writing, and then there's moments where it just drones on and on and on, and I feel like it doesn't completely live up to what Schumacher was hoping it would be. And then I read Drama by Raina Telgemeier, which I thought was kind of bland. In a month where I read Fun Home and Swamp Thing, comics with something to say, something of substance, and a good way of channeling that, Drama felt a little one note to me. Like, it was an interesting story about high school and relationships and people sort of coming to terms with their LGBT identities. But compared to such heavy hitters like Fun Home and Swamp Thing, it felt a little empty. Like she was merely just telling a story without anything behind it, anything supporting it. And it's fine, but it's never gonna reach the upper echelons of my preferred, at least, graphic novels. It might be interesting to readers out there, but unfortunately, I've come to expect more substance from the short stories, or not the short stories, but the graphic novels that I've been reading. But speaking of short stories, I read a number of them for the month of February, including Blues Ain't No Mockingbird by Tony K. Bambara, which I thought was poignant, very interesting about how we typically, don't respect Black individuals in their request for privacy, and we sort of glamorize or put their poverty on display as a way of sort of sending a message to others. I really enjoyed it. It was probably one of the better short stories that I've read for the month of February. I also read The Boy and the Bayonet by Paul Laurence Dunbar, which was okay. Awa by Keisha Bush, which I thought was sad and pretty good. Highlighting how in many societies we put an onus on children to take care and make the ends meet for the family, and also noting how there's in some third world countries, quote unquote, there are many wealthy people who come into that country as a way of exploiting resources and taking various profits and whatnot from that country, and even though they could solve a lot of that country's problems, they choose to just take those resources and leave, and that puts an undue burden on the people who live there, who can't help their country achieve the greatest that it can be. And then I also read Sweetness by Toni Morrison, which I thought was pretty great. A really solid short story, like really short story, about colorism and racism and those kinds of ideas. As the boys at the Codex Cantina said when I watched their video, like they pointed out, can you be called one of the greatest short story writers if you've only written 2 short stories? And I agree with that. Like Toni Morrison only wrote 2 of them, but she writes a compelling 2 short stories. Although I've only read 1 of them, so I can't fully say that. But I did enjoy Sweetness, and I do recommend it to you out there if you haven't already read it. And then I read a number of poems also by Black writers for Black History Month. I encourage you to go check out my Poetry Thursday videos to find out a little bit more about that. Now, what do I have planned for the month of March? For March, my TBR includes a number of books, including The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson seems to be a well-acclaimed author on BookTube, and I've heard a lot of people talk about him. I personally don't read fantasy, so I haven't come across his work very much. But I have had a lot of friends tell me to read The Way of Kings and Stormlight Archives, and I figure I'd give The Way of Kings a look-see before I dive deep into the Stormlight Archives. I've heard a lot of weird things about Brandon Sanderson, so this might be the only book I ever read from him. But I'm very much enthused to see what he is, what he's trying to say, what world he creates, and how he goes about it in comparison to, say, a Dune or a Lord of the Rings, which I've read before. So be on the lookout for that. I also am planning on reading Persepolis. This is another book club read. If you want to join, don't forget to click on the Discord below. I don't remember who the author is, but I do know that it is about feminism and being a woman in Iran. So it should be a pretty interesting read there. I also have The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman in the bullpen, or whatever you want to say there. Again, it's always fun to explore Gaiman, so I'm really hoping for another high quality read, a la, say, The Sandman or Stardust, which I thought was a really solid read. And then I also want to read Passing by Nell Larson. That was actually recommended to me in the comments by an observer of my videos, a viewer of my videos, and it probably would have been more appropriate to read in Black History Month, but we're going to read some black literature outside of Black History Month too, so I'm looking forward to reading that if I have time in the month of March or probably April. And then of course I also want to get back to Shakespeare, so I'm going to read Macbeth, which I've read parts of in high school. I haven't read all of, so be on the lookout for that as well. And then a number of library reads, whether they be graphic novels or books that I pick out at random. Should be a fun time there. And then I have a number of short stories that I have planned, including from authors like Chinua Achebe in his short story Civil Peace, and The Hanging Stranger by Philip K. Dick. And longtime viewers know that I'm a big fan of Philip K. Dick, so be on the lookout for that video as well. And then I have a number of poems planned as well. Nothing in particular selected so far, but it's always a joy to be able to talk about poetry, so be on the lookout for those videos. And so that was my wrap up and my TBR. Very much looking forward to reading some fantasy and Shakespeare and whatnot in the month of March. If you have any recommendations for me, like that person who recommended Passing by Nell Larson, let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing from you and just anyone out there and getting recommendations that I otherwise might not have known about, because I don't think I've ever heard of Passing, but apparently it's a big deal in terms of sort of the Black literary canon and literature in general. So looking forward to that. Otherwise, comment below if you just have something to say about something I've selected, or like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this channel or one of the books that I've talked about, or just writing weird comments in general. But other than that, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and literary travels. Farewell.